3 men in county uniforms chained Everett Sloane's farm gate, shoved an eviction order into his chest, and told him the property now belonged to the HOA. Their badges looked real. Their patrol SUV looked real. Even the court seal looked convincing. But Everett noticed one fatal mistake. The warrant number belonged to a traffic case closed 6 years earlier. He said nothing. Instead, he let HOA President Marissa Klein smile for the cameras while her deputies hauled his equipment outside. By sunset, cruisers surrounded the farm, and Everett returned wearing the sheriff's star, holding Marissa's arrest warrant in his hand. Stay with Everett until the final gate opens, because Marissa's fake eviction is about to trigger a very real reckoning. At 12 minutes past 7 that morning, mist was still clinging to the low fields when Everett crouched beside the irrigation line outside his barn, checking a valve that had been leaking since the week before. He heard the engine before he saw it, a heavy diesel growl rolling up the gravel drive, and when he stood and turned, a black and white SUV was already coming straight through his open gate, followed by 2 pickup trucks, stamped with the logo of the Silvercrest HOA Compliance Division. 3 men in crisp brown uniforms climbed out, moving with the practiced confidence of people who expected no resistance, and the one leading them wore a silver badge that read Black Ridge County Deputy Sheriff, beneath a name he never bothered to give. He didn't ask Everett who he was. He didn't need to because he already assumed he knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. A stubborn farmer about to be shown how little his stubbornness mattered. He dropped a thick stack of papers onto the hood of the truck and announced in a flat, rehearsed voice that Everett Sloane was to vacate the property immediately. The reasons were listed out in careful, official-looking print: $184,600 in unpaid HOA dues, accumulated legal fees, multiple zoning violations, a court-approved seizure order, and enforcement authority granted by the Black Ridge County Court itself. Everett let his eyes move down the page without a flicker crossing his face, though inside he already understood something was deeply wrong, because his family's farm had stood on that exact ground for 52 years, before Silvercrest Estates had even broken ground, and it had never once in any recorded document belonged to that homeowners association. He kept reading, kept his breathing even, and then his eyes stopped, cold on a single line near the bottom of the page. Warrant number, WR-19-4472. He knew that number. He had signed off on that exact case file himself years earlier, long before he ever held elected office, because it belonged to a reckless driving citation that had been closed and archived 6 full years ago. Nothing to do with land, nothing to do with eviction. When Everett asked calmly which judge had signed the order, the man calling himself Derek Boone told him flatly that it wasn't his business to ask. That answer was the second mistake, because by then Everett had already clocked the wrong font stamped across the vehicle's door panel. The radio antenna mounted in a place no real patrol unit would ever use, and a body camera positioned at an angle that violated the department's own equipment standards, down to the letter. He said none of this aloud. Instead, he slid his hand casually into his jacket pocket, thumbed on a small voice recorder, and let it sit quietly against the fabric of his shirt, because he wanted to know exactly how far Marissa Klein was willing to take this before he showed his hand. A white Mercedes eased up the drive a few minutes later, tires crunching softly over gravel, and Marissa stepped out in a tailored blazer, sunglasses, pushed up into her hair, surveying the fields like a woman already walking through property she considered hers. She told the men without so much as glancing at Everett directly to finally get him off her property. Everett turned to face her fully for the first time and asked in a voice that gave away nothing whose property she meant. Marissa smiled, the kind of smile reserved for people who believe they've already won, and told him it wasn't his anymore, not anymore Mr. Sloane. In that single exchange, something settled in Everett's chest, a quiet certainty that this was not another routine HOA harassment letter, not another empty threat meant to wear him down. They intended to take the entire farm, every acre of it, before the sun went down that same day. 3 months before that morning, Silvercrest Estates had quietly begun planning an expansion of 46 luxury homes directly behind Everett's back pasture, and the single obstacle standing between the developers and their profits was access, because only one narrow public road served the entire community. If the HOA could establish a right-of-way cutting straight through Everett's land, the value of that expansion would climb by millions of dollars almost overnight. Marissa had approached him first with an offer to purchase a 60-foot strip along his eastern boundary, phrased politely enough over coffee in her clubhouse office, and Everett had declined without much explanation. She raised the number twice more over the following weeks, each time expecting him to break, and each time he simply repeated that the land wasn't for sale. What followed after that was a slow, calculated campaign of pressure disguised as bureaucracy. Penalty letters for HOA violations that shouldn't have applied to him at all. Notices demanding he mow grass along a property line that wasn't even his orders, to tear down a decades-old barn for supposedly violating an aesthetic code, invented road maintenance fees, invented landscaping fees, and finally, something labeled only as a special assessment, with no further explanation attached. Everett answered every single letter with the same unwavering sentence, that his property had never been and was not now part of the Silvercrest Homeowners Association. A week after his final reply, the HOA mailed him a revised community map, and there, stretched across a section of his own pasture in fresh ink, was a new HOA boundary line that had never existed before, cutting straight through land his family had farmed for over half a century. Everett carried that map directly to Wesley Hart, the county's longtime surveyor, a careful man who had walked nearly every parcel line in Blackridge County at some point in his career. Wesley studied the document for less than a minute before shaking his head, pointing out that the parcel numbers listed didn't correspond to anything on record, as though two entirely separate land files had been quietly stitched together to manufacture a boundary that had no legal basis whatsoever. Everett suspected fraud from that very moment, but he held himself back from confronting Marissa directly, choosing instead to wait and watch, because what he wanted most wasn't a quick argument he could win on principle. He wanted to know precisely who was behind the scheme, how deep it ran, and how far they were willing to go before he moved against them. At the same time, Everett was still living through the early, unglamorous weeks of his own transition into public office. Having recently been sworn in as sheriff of Blackridge County, spending most of his days in jeans and work boots, while the department slowly reorganized itself under his direction, rather than parading around in uniform for show. Marissa had never once met him in his role as sheriff, had never even seen a photograph of him in that capacity, and in her mind he remained nothing more than a difficult, old-fashioned rancher who refused to see reason. That single assumption, more than any forged document or hired impersonator, would become the greatest miscalculation of her entire scheme. Shortly after the fraudulent map arrived in his mailbox, Everett received a short anonymous message warning him that next time they wouldn't be sending lawyers to his door. Back at the farm on that same tense morning, Marissa gave a small, almost bored gesture with her hand, and Derek led the two other men into the barn, slapping bright orange stickers across every piece of equipment they passed, each one printed with the words "seized by county order." They hauled out the welder first, then the generator, then pieces of farm machinery Everett had maintained by hand for years, followed by a locked filing cabinet, and finally the keys to his tractor, carried out like trophies. Everett positioned himself directly in front of the tractor, arms crossed, refusing to move, even as Derek ordered him to step aside. Two of the men closed in on either side of him, one gripping his forearm while Derek produced a set of handcuffs from his belt, and Everett asked very slowly and very deliberately whether he was being placed under arrest. Derek answered that he was being detained for interfering with a lawful eviction, a phrase delivered with the flat confidence of someone reciting a line he'd rehearsed, and it was exactly the sentence Everett needed captured clearly on record. He let Derek close one cuff around his wrist without resistance, then turned his head just enough to look directly into the fake body camera clipped to the man's chest, asking him calmly to state his name and badge number for the record. Derek's composure cracked for the first time, his jaw tightening, and from somewhere behind him, Marissa's voice cut sharply through the morning air, telling them to stop wasting time playing games and simply remove him from the property. Everett was walked, still cuffed on one wrist, off the land his family had worked for 2 generations. While behind him, the crew looped a heavy new chain across the gate and mounted a fresh sign declaring the property under Silvercrest HOA. Control. While every set of eyes remained fixed on Everett being marched toward the road, he quietly pressed a small button hidden along the side of his watch, sending a silent signal across the county to Naomi Price, his undersheriff, and one of the only people who knew exactly what he'd been preparing for. The message that reached her read-only 3 words package is active. Naomi understood immediately that the plan Everett had been carefully assembling ever since that anonymous warning had finally begun to unfold. She didn't dispatch marked cruisers right away, resisting every instinct to move fast, because she knew Everett wanted this handled with precision rather than urgency. Instead, she quietly sent 2 real deputies in plain clothes to a stretch of county road to the east, positioning them with long lenses to begin documenting everything from a distance that wouldn't spook anyone into stopping. Everett wanted more than fake uniforms captured on camera. He wanted the impersonation, the forged paperwork, the man giving orders, and the physical seizure of private land, all tied together in one continuous, undeniable sequence, rather than scattered incidents. Someone with a good lawyer could explain away one piece at a time. As the crew worked through the barn, Marissa stepped a few paces away and placed a call to someone still unidentified, telling them flatly that the farm was secured, and it was time to start moving the road crew a sentence. Everett caught clearly through the open window of the TANF, nearest truck, and one that finally revealed in plain language exactly what this entire operation had been about from the very beginning. Marissa had no intention of waiting patiently for any court to weigh in on the matter. Within the hour, a contractor's excavator rumbled onto the property on a flatbed trailer, and a small crew began driving stakes into the ground along a strip of pasture that cut directly through Everett's land, the very same route the HOA had tried and failed to purchase from him months earlier. Everett stood just outside the gate watching the stakes go in one by one, and told Derek plainly that if they started digging, this would become something far bigger than any homeowners association dispute could ever be. Derek let out a short laugh and asked what exactly Everett thought he was going to do about it, call the sheriff. Marissa overheard the exchange from a few yards away and burst into genuine laughter, walking closer and repeating the taunt herself with obvious relish, telling him to go right ahead, please call the sheriff. Everett answered simply that he might do exactly that, and neither of them understood, not even for a second, what those three quiet words actually meant. The excavator dropped its bucket into the soil with a heavy metallic groan, tearing through a stretch of fence that had stood since Everett's father first built it decades earlier, and crushing a gatepost worn smooth by 2 generations of hands, all of it captured cleanly on the farm's own. Security cameras mounted along the barn roof. Naomi quietly routed the live feed directly to Caleb Foster, the county prosecutor, a careful and methodical man who wanted to intervene the moment he saw the footage. But Everett asked for a little more time, knowing full well that fake deputies alone might not be enough to prove Marissa herself had personally directed the entire operation from start to finish. Then the proof he needed arrived on its own, unprompted. Marissa handed Derek a folder and announced loud enough to be picked up clearly on camera that once Sloan was gone for good, nobody would be able to stop them from opening the road. When Derek asked almost nervously what would happen if the county ever checked the original order, Marissa told him without hesitation that by the time anyone bothered to check, the road would already be built and finished. Caleb heard every word of it through the live feed and immediately began drafting the affidavit for a search warrant right there at his desk while across town. Wesley Hart confirmed something even more damning than the forged map. The county clerk's signature stamped across the eviction document was itself a forgery, and the official seal beside it had been scanned directly from an entirely unrelated public record and pasted in digitally. This was no longer a simple property line dispute between neighbors. It had become a coordinated conspiracy to impersonate law enforcement, forge official government documents, and seize private land through force and intimidation, and Caleb picked up his phone to tell Naomi it was time to get the real units ready to move. By early afternoon, Everett deliberately pulled back from the farm, entirely driving off down the county road without a word, and Marissa assumed with satisfaction that he had simply given up and accepted defeat. She returned to the Silvercrest clubhouse and opened a bottle of champagne with several members of the board, all grown adults gathered around the polished bar, toasting to a new access road that would finally allow the HOA to sell 46 additional luxury lots and add nearly $11 million in projected value to the development. Derek's security team, meanwhile, had been promised a substantial bonus if the eviction was fully completed before 5 o'clock that same evening, and they worked with renewed urgency once Everett was gone. Back on the farm, his chain was cut away and replaced. The HOA's sign was hammered firmly into the dirt near the gate. His equipment was loaded and hauled off the property entirely. Another long stretch of his fence was torn down, and fresh survey stakes marked with official-looking flags were driven into the soil to outline a boundary line that had never legally existed in any courthouse record. Marissa even sent someone to change the locks on the barn doors, treating the property as though it were already fully hers. But Everett hadn't run from any of it, and he certainly hadn't given up. He had driven straight to the Blackridge County Sheriff's office. Inside, he walked to his locker, without a word to anyone, pulled off the worn ranch jacket he'd been wearing all morning, and underneath it hung his full sheriff's uniform, pressed and weighting the badge. Catching the overhead light, he pinned it carefully to his chest. Naomi was already standing beside a long table, every piece of gathered evidence laid out in neat labeled rows, and when she asked if he was finally ready, Everett glanced at the monitor beside her, watching Marissa walk freely across his own pasture, as though she had already won, and told her not yet. Moments later, Caleb walked in, carrying a freshly signed search warrant covering both the HOA's clubhouse office and Derek's personal phone, but the one document Everett wanted most, an arrest warrant bearing Marissa's own name, still required stronger proof that she had personally known. The deputies were fake from the very start of the plan. Naomi pulled up an audio clip recorded earlier that morning, Marissa's own voice caught clearly instructing Derek to strip the fake badge numbers off an invoice before anyone outside the group ever saw it. The room went completely quiet for a moment. It was direct, unambiguous evidence of intent, exactly the kind no defense attorney could easily explain away, and Caleb turned toward the door, telling them he could absolutely work with that. At the courthouse across town, a judge on weekend call reviewed the entire assembled file piece by piece, The farm's own security footage, the forged community map, the falsified invoice images of the fake uniforms and vehicle markings, the fraudulent eviction order itself, the recorded audio, confessions, Wesley's sworn written statement, and Naomi's detailed incident report compiled over the course of the day. The warrant that came back a short while later wasn't another eviction order. It was an arrest warrant, and the name printed clearly at the top of the page belonged to Marissa Klein. Everett held the document in the same steady hands that had only hours earlier accepted Derek's forged papers without protest, and the symmetry of it wasn't lost on him for even a moment. Naomi quietly assembled a small team of real deputies for the drive out to the farm, deliberately choosing not to bring in any kind of tactical response or unnecessary show of force, because Everett wanted the contrast between the two groups to be unmistakable to everyone watching. The fake crew had arrived that morning with threats, forged paperwork, and cold intimidation. The real one would arrive with careful process, solid evidence, and a lawful order signed by an actual judge. 6 patrol cruisers pulled out of the station lot in a quiet, orderly line, no sirens blaring, no lights flashing. Everett leading the way in the front vehicle. Back at the farm, one of Derek's lookouts posted along the county road called in a warning that multiple marked county units were approaching fast. Derek looked over at Marissa, searching her face for some sign of concern, but she remained perfectly calm, certain the visit was nothing more than a routine check. She could easily talk her way through, telling him she would simply show them the original court order herself if it came to that. Derek knew better than anyone that the order was completely fake, and he suggested quietly that they leave immediately while they still could. But Marissa blocked his path toward the truck, reminding him sharply that he was wearing a badge and needed to act like it meant something. It was in that exact moment that Derek finally understood with a cold and sinking clarity that Marissa intended to let him absorb the full weight of the blame the moment this plan started to fall apart around them. In the distance, a thin line of dust began rising along the county road. One vehicle at first, then a second, until all 6 cruisers came fully into view, moving steadily closer. Marissa smoothed the front of her blazer with both hands and walked toward the gate to meet whoever was in charge, still completely unaware of exactly who that sheriff actually was. The convoy came to a stop directly in front of the chain the HOA had strung across Everett's gate that afternoon, and Naomi stepped out of the lead vehicle, first calm and unhurried. Derek tried desperately to hold his role together, stepping forward and introducing himself as Deputy Boone, there to execute a court-ordered eviction. But when Naomi asked plainly which division within the department he belonged to, had absolutely nothing to say. When she pressed further and asked who his sheriff was, he simply stood there in silence, unable to produce even a single name. Marissa cut in sharply, insisting this was strictly HOA business carried out under full legal authority, and Naomi told her without raising her voice that the sheriff himself would be the one to make that determination. Still confident, still certain of her own position, Marissa asked exactly where he was, and the door of the lead cruiser swung open in response. A single boot hit the gravel driveway. Everett stepped out fully into view, no longer dressed in flannel and worn denim, but wearing his complete sheriff's uniform from collar to boot, a silver badge gleaming on his chest that read unmistakably Sheriff Blackridge County. For a long moment, absolutely no one spoke. Derek's face drained of color entirely, and one of the 2 men still posing as deputies quietly slid his hand away from his duty belt, as though the weight of it had suddenly become too much to hold. Marissa looked at Everett, then at Naomi, then back at Everett again, unable to reconcile the 2 completely different images now standing in front of her. Everett walked slowly toward the exact same section of gate where he had been dragged out in handcuffs only hours earlier that same morning, and Marissa managed only a single broken word, "you," before her voice failed her entirely. Everett reminded her, quietly, and without a trace of anger, that she had told him to call the sheriff, and after a brief, deliberate pause, added that he had done exactly that. He held out his hand, and Naomi placed a thin folder into his palm. Marissa assumed for just a moment that it was some kind of formal response to her own eviction paperwork, until Everett opened the first page and turned it toward her, showing her that her own full name was printed clearly across the top. "Your warrant was fake," he told her, before raising the second document in his other hand for her to see. "This one isn't." Everett didn't move toward retaliation of any kind, and he didn't raise his voice even once. He read Marissa her rights aloud in full, stating the exact grounds for her arrest clearly and completely for the official record. Marissa immediately began protesting that this whole thing was nothing more than personal retaliation against her, and Everett simply gestured toward the row of cameras, still mounted along his own barn roof, telling her calmly that this wasn't retaliation at all. That was evidence, plain and simple. Sensing perhaps his only remaining chance to protect himself, Derek suddenly blurted out that she was the one who had hired all of them in the first place. And Marissa spun toward him just as he revealed in a rush of words that his private security company had accepted the entire contract, directly. from the Homeowners Association, complete with uniforms deliberately designed to resemble genuine county deputies, an SUV wrapped and painted to mimic an actual sheriff's patrol vehicle replica badges, purchased specifically for the job instructions for the eviction operation itself, the physical seizure of Everett's farm equipment, and explicit orders to physically prevent him from returning to his own property by any means necessary. Marissa denied every word of it, growing more frantic by the second until Naomi produced Derek's own phone, lawfully seized earlier that same afternoon under the search warrant, displaying an invoice still open on the screen with a line item that read in plain black text, "Law Enforcement Appearance Package, $8,400. Marissa had absolutely nothing left to say in response. The other two men who had spent the morning posing as deputies began cooperating almost immediately, one of them admitting quietly that Marissa herself had personally instructed the crew that if Sloan resisted in any way, they were to cuff him without hesitation. Everett glanced down at the very same pair of handcuffs Derek had used on him earlier that morning, as Naomi ordered him to turn around. And this time, the sharp metallic click of real handcuffs closing meant something entirely different for everyone standing there. Marissa backed slowly toward her Mercedes, only to find a deputy already standing calmly in her path, and it took nothing more than a quiet "Don't ma'am" before she too was placed in handcuffs, standing directly beside the very sign that still read property under silver crest. HOA control. Everett walked over, pulled the metal sign cleanly out of the ground with both hands, and let it drop into the dirt at her feet, telling her simply not anymore. The search warrant executed later that evening at the Silvercrest Clubhouse turned up considerably more than anyone had initially expected to find. Marissa hadn't only forged Everett's eviction order for personal gain. Investigators discovered a folder buried deep on her office computer labeled Property Pressure, containing detailed files on several other landowners scattered around the perimeter of Silvercrest Estates. All of them adults, each one targeted at various points using nearly identical tactics, invented penalty charges pulled from nowhere, threats of formal property liens subtly altered, boundary maps forged, legal notices mailed under official-looking, letterhead sustained pressure to sell land far below its actual market value, and private security contractors used repeatedly to intimidate residents into quiet compliance. Everett's farm had always represented the single largest target in the entire scheme, simply because the road cutting through his land determined whether the whole luxury expansion could ever move forward at all. Wesley discovered digging further into the HOA's own records that Marissa had knowingly presented a falsified map to potential investors specifically to convince them the right-of-way already existed on paper, and that if Everett had been kept off his own land long enough for construction crews to finish paving the new road, she had planned to simply claim afterward that the easement had already been established through use, regardless of what any court might later say. Several members of the HOA board later insisted with varying degrees of sincerity that they had no idea the deputies involved were entirely fake, but internal emails uncovered during the investigation clearly proved that at least two of them had known exactly what was happening from the very beginning and chosen to look the other way. Everett made a deliberate choice not to turn any part of this into a personal campaign of revenge against Marissa or anyone connected to her. He handed the entire case over completely to investigators and the prosecutor's office, stepping back from any decisions that might reasonably be seen as a conflict of interest, given that he himself had been the primary victim of the scheme from the very start. And that quiet restraint said far more about the kind of man he truly was than any accusation leveled against Marissa ever could. He held real legitimate power in his hands and refused at every turn to bend it toward his own advantage, standing in direct and deliberate contrast to everything Marissa had done. Silvercrest was ultimately forced to halt all construction on the disputed road indefinitely, pull every piece of equipment off Everett's land for good, fully restore the section of fence that had been torn down that morning, return every item of farm equipment that had been seized, and formally abandon any remaining claim to a single acre of his property. Nervous investors froze the entire 46-home expansion project shortly afterward, and the HOA board voted almost unanimously to remove Marissa from her position as president while she was still actively facing criminal charges in, quote, court. Several weeks later, on a quiet, ordinary morning with no cameras waiting and no crowd gathered, a new steel gate stood firmly in the exact spot where the old one had been torn down and chained shut against Everett's will. It wasn't oversized, and it wasn't built as any kind of monument to what had happened that terrible day. It was simply a boundary plane and functional, with a small sign mounted beside it reading Sloan Farm Private Property, nothing more elaborate than that. Everett stood quietly nearby, watching a contractor pull the last of the fake survey stakes out of the soft ground one by one, tossing each into a growing pile beside the truck. Naomi arrived a short while later carrying the final report from the investigation, and the two of them talked briefly beside the fence line. Derek had ultimately accepted a formal cooperation agreement with prosecutors, giving them a full and detailed account of exactly how Marissa had organized and directed the entire impersonation scheme from the very beginning, down to the smallest details. The charges against Marissa herself centered on the use of forged government documents, a coordinated conspiracy to seize private property through fraud and intimidation, and the deliberate use of individuals impersonating sworn law enforcement officers, with the ultimate outcome left entirely in the hands of the court to decide in the months ahead. Everett found no particular satisfaction in the simple fact of her arrest, and he never once claimed otherwise to anyone who asked. What mattered most to him far more than any personal vindication was the underlying principle at stake in the whole ordeal, that a homeowners association could reasonably manage the shared affairs of its own community. But it could never legitimately transform itself into a substitute for actual government, and that a uniform purchased and paid for out of a private budget could never manufacture real lawful authority, no matter how convincing it looked. From a distance, the final quiet moment of that long, exhausting week brought him back to the exact same spot where everything had first begun that morning. Everett reached down and picked up the forged eviction order, now sealed carefully inside a clear evidence bag, and set it down gently beside a copy of the real warrant that had carried Marissa's own name across the top of the page. One document had been created for a single purpose: to strip an honest man of something that had rightfully belonged to his family for over half a century. The other had been signed for an entirely different purpose: to finally hold the person responsible for that lie accountable in front of the law she had tried so hard to imitate. Everett closed the new gate behind him and looped the fresh chain through it, testing the latch with one hand. A neighbor from farther down the county road, another adult resident who had heard bits and pieces of the story secondhand, called out from across the fence line to ask whether he thought anyone might ever try something like that again. Everett looked down the long, empty stretch of road the HOA had once planned to pave straight through his family's pasture, and answered simply not with fake badges. He turned and walked back toward the barn without another word, the morning light stretching long and gold across the open fields behind him. The 94 acres stood exactly as they always had, untouched and unbroken, the road Silvercrest had wanted so desperately, coming to a quiet, permanent end right at the edge of the Sloan property line. In the days that followed, the story of what happened on the Sloan property spread quietly through the rest of Blackridge County, carried mostly by word of mouth among people who had lived there long enough to remember when Silvercrest estates had been nothing but open pasture and a dirt access road. Several longtime residents came forward on their own, describing letters they had received from the HOA over the past 2 years, demanding payments for violations. They insisted they had never actually committed penalties, calculated against boundary lines that shifted slightly with every new revision of the community map. A retired school teacher who lived along the northern edge of the development admitted she had nearly sold her late husband's 5 acres at half its true value after receiving 3 separate notices threatening a lien against her home, notices that investigators later confirmed had never been filed with the county at all. A widowed rancher, 2 properties down from Everett, said he had paid nearly $6,000 in what he believed were legitimate road maintenance fees before Wesley's audit revealed the road in question didn't even run through his land. Each new account added another layer to the file Caleb was assembling, and each one made clear that Everett's farm, as large and valuable as it was, had never been an isolated target, but simply the final, most ambitious piece of a pattern that had been running quietly beneath the surface of the community for years. Wesley spent the better part of 2 weeks working through the HOA's archived land records at the county office, cross-referencing every parcel map filed under Silvercrest's name against the original survey documents held in the courthouse basement. What he found was a pattern too consistent to be accidental small adjustments made year after year. A few feet here, a slightly redrawn boundary. There, each change modest enough on its own to avoid drawing attention, but cumulative enough over time to have quietly expanded the HOA's claimed footprint by dozens of acres it had never legally owned. He testified later that in his 3 decades surveying land across the county, he had never once encountered fraud carried out with this much patience, executed slowly enough that no single document ever looked alarming in isolation. Caleb built much of the eventual case around exactly that pattern, arguing that the forged eviction order used against Everett wasn't an isolated act of desperation, but the natural endpoint of a scheme that had been tested and refined for years against people with fewer resources and less standing to fight back. Naomi, for her part, spent those same weeks working closely with the district attorney's office to build out the impersonation charges against Derek's security firm, tracing the paper trail of contracts signed with at least 4 other homeowners associations across 2 neighboring counties. It turned out Silvercrest hadn't been Derek's only client interested in a law enforcement appearance package, and the discovery opened a second wider investigation into whether similar tactics had been used elsewhere against property owners who had never suspected the deputies confronting them weren't real. Naomi briefed Everett on the expanding scope of the case in his office one evening, laying photographs and invoices across his desk, and Everett sat quietly for a long moment before saying only that he was glad they had caught it here in his county before it reached somewhere without a sheriff paying close enough attention. It was as close as he ever came to acknowledging out loud how differently the entire morning could have gone if he had simply been an ordinary rancher with no badge waiting for him back at the station. The formal hearing, where Marissa's charges were first read into the court record, drew a larger crowd than anyone at the courthouse had expected, filling most of the gallery with residents from Silvercrest and the surrounding county, alike adults who had come simply to see the process play out in person. Marissa appeared composed throughout her attorney, arguing that her actions, however aggressive, had been undertaken in good faith on behalf of the association's financial interests, framing the prosecution methodically dismantled piece by piece, using her own recorded words. Derek's cooperation proved decisive in several key moments, his testimony filling in details that the physical evidence alone could only imply, including confirmation that Marissa had personally reviewed and approved the fake uniforms before they were ever ordered. When the judge eventually set a trial date months out, Marissa was released on conditions that barred her from any contact with HOA business or Everett's property, a restriction that effectively ended her involvement with Silvercrest Estates for good regardless of the trial's final outcome. Back at the farm, life slowly settled back into its old familiar rhythm, though not without visible reminders of what had happened. Everett rebuilt the fence line himself over several weekends, working alongside 2 ranch hands who had helped his father decades earlier, replacing every post the excavator had crushed with new lumber cut and set by hand rather than simply patched over. He left the old gate post, standing where it had fallen for exactly 1 week before finally hauling it away, telling Naomi when she asked that he'd wanted a little time to look at it and remember exactly what had been taken from him so he wouldn't forget how easily it had almost happened. The barn locks were changed back. The equipment was returned piece by piece, as investigators cleared each item from evidence, and the survey stakes that had marked a boundary invented out of nothing were pulled from the ground and stacked in section piece by piece, a pile near the tool shed, kept as a reminder rather than discarded entirely. Neighbors stopped by more often than usual in those first few weeks, some out of genuine concern, others simply curious to hear the story firsthand, and Everett answered their questions patiently each time, never once exaggerating what had happened, never once needing to. The road Silvercrest had once planned to build straight through his pasture remained nothing more than a faded line of stakes pulled from the ground, and a set of blueprints quietly shelved somewhere in a filing cabinet that no longer mattered. The 46 luxury homes that were supposed to rise behind his fence line stayed unbuilt, their investors long since scattered to other projects in other counties, uninterested in returning to a development now permanently tied to a criminal case. Silvercrest Estates itself limped forward under new leadership, a smaller, quieter board more interested in managing landscaping disputes than reshaping property lines to suit ambitious expansion plans. Everett rarely spoke about any of it unless directly asked, and even then his answers stayed short and unadorned. The same steady tone he'd used the morning Derek first threw the forged papers onto the hood of that truck. He wasn't interested in being remembered as the sheriff who outmaneuvered a corrupt HOA president, and he said as much whenever anyone tried to frame it that way. He simply wanted his fence line, respected his gate left alone, and the county he'd sworn to protect kept a little safer for the next person who might not have a badge waiting for them back at the station. Marissa came to Everett's farm carrying a fake order to take his land. She left in a real sheriff's cruiser under a warrant bearing her own name.